will be helping to flag questions so we can make sure that we get everything answered for you. Of course, things come up. People have to leave a little bit early. If you missed the last 15 minutes of this presentation, we've got you covered. You're going to get a recording of this presentation. It'll be in your inbox in an email in a day or two. So don't worry about taking super detailed notes, or if you have to miss a couple minutes at the end for a hard stop or another meeting or family needs that pop up. So we are super excited to have you here today. Mari, if you want to pop me to the next slide.
Sure thing. And can you see everything okay?
Yeah, I can. It looks great.
Good.
Awesome. So I see a ton of familiar faces in the participants today, but I also see a lot of new folks that I'm really excited to meet and get to know. My name is Georgina Donahue. I am our Director of Community at Pragmatic, and our community is you. So we're delighted to have you here today. These really awesome kind of calls where we get to connect with thought leaders and subject matter experts are part of what our community is really committed to. We also have a lot of other community programs that I encourage you to check out. You can see the URL there. But really our goal is to make sure that no matter what your question is about product, we've got an answer for you, and we've got someone that's been through it before that can help and support you. So really happy to have all of you as part of our community. We can pop to the next slide if you don't mind. Thank you. So today I'm really excited for this conversation. Our guest is Mari Escalona-Juretic. She's a senior product manager at Groupon. She's got such strong experience in the end-to-end product development areas, as well as go-to-market strategy. So Mari has a really great approach for leveraging data to understand customer problems and also tracks buying patterns to identify opportunities, right? Exactly what we all want to do. So she's got this total knack for building loyalty that keeps customers coming back again and again. And so we're really, really delighted to learn from her today. And today we're going to be talking buyer personas. So we'll talk about how to discover persona patterns that have a real impact on your business, how to utilize those different buyer habits to create products that people want to buy, and really turn those into conversion opportunities. So Mari, I'm so delighted to have you here. Thank you very much for sharing with us. And I will pass it right over to you.
Thanks, Georgina. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So let's just dive right in. All right, so just wanted to give you guys a brief overview of who I am. So I'm Mari Escalona-Juretic. I'm currently a senior product manager at Groupon. So I currently focus on product management within our advertising space. And I really help lead advertising solutions for a two-sided marketplace. So I'm really thinking about the Groupon consumer, so the person who is on Groupon looking for deals, as well as our suppliers and our advertiser merchants who are looking to showcase their deals on our site. So I've been there for about a year now. Before that, I was at Expedia for about 6.5 years, also doing something very similar, but obviously within the travel space. And I was a product manager also in the media group, leading our product development and go-to-market strategy for some of our display products, as well as our native ad products. And before that, I was actually in the paid search world. I've been in advertising for quite a few years now. And with that said, let's jump right into buyer personas. All right, so as Georgina said, we're going to be talking about, how do you really understand the patterns of your buyers so that you can really turn those opportunities into conversions and grow your business. So brief agenda here. The first thing I'm going to go over is, what a buyer persona is. I'm pretty sure most, if not all of you know what that is, but I just wanted to give you kind of a brief, just level set to make sure we're kind of all on the same page when we're talking about buyer personas. Then talking about, why is that important for your business? And then how do you go about creating a buyer persona? What are the things that you look for? And then I'll go over a buyer persona example, and then end with some conversion opportunities that I've seen that work. All right. So again, I think most of you are probably familiar with a buyer persona, what a buyer persona is. It's a semi-fictional representation of, your end user or your customer, and that's really based on customer insights and data that you get about your customer. I wanted to highlight like that the goal of a buyer persona isn't really to just profile. So you're not just giving like plain old demographics about age and location and occupation, but you're really trying to uncover behavior patterns, and those behavior patterns are going to help shape your buyer persona. They provide insight on what drives your buyer to interact with your business. And then why is a buyer persona important? In my mind, with product management, you really want to focus on the customer first, right? That's kind of I would say the core foundation of product management, product development. You want to make sure that you really understand what the customer needs are. And it allows you to have, more empathy for your customer. You want to put yourself in their shoes. Another point is, it helps you to identify the right business or product strategy. So as product managers, as business people, as you know, we are thrown a lot of different tasks, a lot of different initiatives, right? And, at the end of the day, there's only so much we can do. And we want to highlight and pinpoint the priorities and initiatives that really drive impact. So this can really help you narrow in and hone in on what that should be. And it helps you also to define those product requirements and really prioritize those product features. And then lastly, it really allows you as a team, as as product managers, you're working with various stakeholders. In my role, I'm working with engineering very closely, design, sales, finance, and the list goes on and on. And you're wanting to, your role is about cross collaboration, right? So you want to make sure that you're aligned with your stakeholders. And I think having a buyer persona is a really good way to make sure you guys are all aligned on a common vision and you're not kind of going in different directions and you're kind of on the same path. All right, so diving into the details here. So how do you create a buyer persona? So I like to think about, I kind of wanted to simplify this because I think these are some really key points into how you're developing a good buyer persona. So the first step 1 and step 2 is really around data. So the first step, and it doesn't have to be in this particular order, but I would say gathering qualitative data. So for example, brainstorming, so working with your other teammates and colleagues on what you think your customer needs are and who your customer base should be. That's kind of a basic, I would say, like probably the easiest, scrappiest way to go about this piece. Another really good way to get qualitative data is like getting sales feedback. For me, for example, I communicate with our sales folks, pretty regularly, sometimes informally. I'll just ping them on Slack. I have a quick question about something. Maybe I see like a metric in terms of, drop off on a certain page of our tool that we work with. And I want to understand what's going on here. And I might just quickly ping, my sales contact and get that feedback, right? So that's really helpful. And then there's more formal, I would say like meetings in terms of getting that feedback of what are you guys seeing? And so that can happen like, regularly, I would say like weekly or however you think, what makes sense for your business. That's super helpful. So whether it's sales or another team, just, I guess, a certain part of your team that works directly with your end user. And then the other piece I would say for qualitative data is user research studies. I realize not everyone can get this, but if you can, these are really, really valuable, to getting some insight on as to kind of what your customer needs and problems and pain points are. And I would encourage you if you can to work, closely with your design team or your research team early on when you're formulating these studies, right? So to make sure that you're getting the right data that you need. And then step 2 is getting quantitative data. So I want to say qualitative data is great, but you definitely want to make sure you combine that with some hard data, some numbers, right? Because I think if you just look at qualitative data, then you kind of, then it gets a little bit tricky in terms of, what you're gathering, and you can tend to stereotype. Sometimes you don't get the full picture, right? So I think in combination with quantitative data, puts you in a really good position. So some examples of what I've done for quantitative data, direct user feedback. If you have a survey on your site, any feedback forms, internal data patterns, like for example, buying frequency, demographic data, or like mobile or device usage, for example, any seasonality trends, anything internally that can tell you like what are the patterns of your buyer. Analytics tools. And then I would say the last one is industry data and research. And I think this one is one that sometimes we don't think about. I think if you don't have, the resourcing or the tooling within your business to get this data, I think another good way to understand your customer is by looking at like external studies, for example. And I'll go into the next slide here and talk a little bit about some examples of this. But if you can look at, depending on your industry, you can look at data. Like I looked at a Google study, or if maybe it's a Harvard Business Review or something like that, on getting some quantitative data that can also be really helpful if you don't have any internal analytics tools or anything like that. And then once you have that qualitative and quantitative data, then you're really ready to build out your persona. So I would say, to start, I would start out small, creating maybe 3 to 5 personas that really represent majority of your business. I know sometimes some businesses, companies, this is going to depend, have a lot more than that. I would say sometimes it's easier to hone in and focus on a few, just so you're doing those few right. Sometimes if you have too many, it can be a little bit scattered, and sometimes you're not able to do all of them really well because there's just too many different personas to manage, and too many, I think, strategies that you might have to tailor. So, and then I would say lastly on that is really to focus on identifying actionable personas. So again, like personas shouldn't just contain like demographic data. They need to contain behavioral patterns that help you make that next step into, okay, how do I grow my business, and how do I create conversions for my business? Okay, and so kind of along with those points, I would say other questions that you want to consider when you are creating your buyer persona, you're thinking about your buyers are, what are their goals and aspirations? What kind of drives them? What are the things that delight them? What are the things that they like to see? And what are their pain points, right? Like you want to make sure that you're focusing on some things that are just not ideal for them, right? I think pain points are a big one that sometimes we forget about. And then how will your product or feature, help improve their personal or professional life? Along the same lines of how can our product meet their specific needs as well? So, all right, so jumping in here to a specific example. So the business here, let's think of an online travel agency. We know I work for Expedia. I will say some of the data is a little bit, it's kind of fictionalized just to kind of protect any data concerns or anything like that. But we're going to look at, Denise, the avid traveler, and then also the travel advertiser. So kind of 2 buyer persona sets. As I said earlier, my expertise is within a 2-sided marketplace. So I really have like 2 customer sets that I'm thinking about, right? And it kind of is similar to when you talk about like 2 different buyer personas. If there's like an end user and then there is like the person that actually buys the product, those can be a little bit different. There's those nuances there. So just wanted to highlight that piece. So here is kind of how the beginning stages, right? That data piece that I was just talking about in the previous slide about, quantitative and qualitative data. So obviously there's going to be probably more data points that you're going to be collecting and gathering, but for the purpose of this example, I wanted to kind of hone in on just like a few key data points. The first one is Google study data. So this is actually data that I really used in my previous role. Basically, Google came out with some data on just kind of understanding like what is the traveler's journey in terms of how do they make a decision to book a trip. one of the key points here was that 60% of travelers are more likely to book with a brand that provides relevant info for destinations they are interested in. I mean, that's not really a surprise, but I think it's good to just have that data right on hand to kind of reaffirm maybe what you're already thinking. Another interesting fact as well from Google study, this is from Expedia, it's on the Expedia blog, is a traveler browses up to 38 websites before booking a trip. So that traveler journey, that research phase, is a pretty lengthy one. And I think if any of you, I'm sure probably quite a few of you are travelers, you probably understand like there's quite a few steps that you go through, right? You're maybe checking out a blog, you're checking out reviews, you're checking out TripAdvisor, you're checking out pricing on an OTA, whether it's Expedia or another one, or, you know, there's just a lot of different steps leading up to a trip. And part of that traveler journey. Some other data points. So travel company user research. So say this is also fictionalized, but say this is, travel company user research that you're getting from a design, basically a research study, and you're talking to people who use your site. Your OTA. So one of the key points here is that, reviews are usually the first thing I look at. And then the second point is like, it's very overwhelming, right? So there are so many choices, it can be overwhelming. It would be nice to only see hotels based on my interest. So 2 pieces of direct feedback from your travelers directly. So I think if you can get that feedback directly from your consumer or your buyer, I think that's really valuable. And then lastly is like internal travel company data. So this is like more of the quantitative hard data piece that I think kind of ties everything together and kind of makes your persona strong. So 85% of travelers use a mobile app, and then 65% of travelers filtered for hotels with guest ratings of 4 or higher. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So with that, after kind of doing all that data gathering, then I moved on to kind of creating a user or a buyer persona. So Denise is the avid traveler. So just to give her a background on her, she is single. She's 31 years old, working as a social media manager at a tech startup. She has a busy social life and she's constantly on the go, and she's visited 23 countries, and she's got a high level of tech knowledge. The next part I think is really what's going to be valuable in terms of travel specific and kind of specific to your kind of business strategy. What are her travel needs and preferences? So she looks for hotels with high ratings. She likes to stay at nice hotels. She likes to stay at quality places. She also enjoys unique travel experiences. And for example, she's really into hiking, or she, as we saw earlier, and she also is, wanting to try out new things that she's never done before. And then she wants to see relevant hotels. We see that she's constantly on the go, makes sense for the millennial age. And so she wants to see, there's a lot of information out there as well as what we saw earlier, right? So she wants to see things that matter, things that she's interested in when she's thinking about and researching a trip. So as I mentioned earlier, my marketplace is 2-sided, right? There is the traveler. So that is basically, Denise, the traveler. And then there is the other side of it, the suppliers, for example, like in this case, Best Stay Hotel. So, how does each buyer set benefit? Denise she's looking for a unique experience. She's looking for a quality hotel, and Best Stay Hotel is looking to showcase like what their unique offering is, and they want to get hotel conversions, right? So I would say whatever is good for the traveler, which is the end user, is also going to be good for, basically for the supplier. So I would say they both kind of benefit from this. And kind of taking it a step further is like, how do I translate this into conversion? So for Denise, the avid traveler, one of the things she mentioned is, a pain point is like, she doesn't want to see irrelevant ads. She's always on the go. She's got a social life. So one of the things that one of the strategies that you could take here is really thinking about relevant targeting, and making sure that you're showing, for example, hotels or stays that are based on her search and purchase history. So that is something that I think you could really hone in on, is really making sure that she sees hotels specific to what she's searched in the past. Like, she's obviously seen, she's going to 38 different touch points, just to kind of research. And so if you can show, if you can make sure that you're showing relevant targeting, I think you can make Denise happy. The other thing is, like, we saw that there's, 85%, there's a high mobile app penetration there. So if you can really focus on your mobile marketing efforts, I think that can also help grow conversions and grow the business as well. So for example, you may want to partner with design on ensuring the seamless experience. Another I think, like, great opportunity is, highlighting relevant hotels and app notifications. If she's using the app, if she's a high user, I think that's a perfect opportunity to show her hotels, and going back again to, like, her search and purchase history, you can have that targeting within what you're sharing there. And then really making sure, one of the things that we noted too was that she only looks at hotels that are 4 stars or higher, right? So you want to make sure that you're building trust within the market by highlighting these review ratings clearly for her. You want to make sure that when she's looking on the website, that, for example, she is able to see and articulate, or to see and really understand, like, hey, this is a 4-star hotel and why. And you want to make sure those reviews are legit too. That's part of, I think, building trust. And then on the flip side, I would say, as I said, everything that you're doing for Denise, the avid traveler, is going to be good for conversions in terms of growth for the supplier, for that specific buyer set, right? So some examples here for Best Stay Hotel, for example, is, you could provide high visibility placements for them. So they want to showcase their brand. They want to be able to target people like Denise, the avid traveler, but they need to have, like, high visibility on your page, high traffic pages, right? Top of funnel. By top of funnel, I mean early on in the user journey or the traveler journey. You can also think about, for example, providing a robust email marketing program throughout the traveler journey. So what I've talked about here is specifically for the research stage of the traveler journey. And, that there's really great opportunity there to leverage, hey, I've seen, send an email after they've been searching, maybe specific hotel, or they've been looking at flights. That's a great opportunity to share, Best Stay Hotel, to share, hey, this might suit your needs. And then even taking that a step further is making sure you're collecting all that data along the way, throughout the traveler journey. And then you can even, once they book their trip, then you can send them, for example, things to do in that destination for where they're booking. So just kind of making sure you're kind of bringing that throughout kind of the whole funnel, and throughout the traveler journey. So collecting all those data points along the way, I think, will also help you lead to a booking or conversion. And then, of course, the last thing that I will say is sponsored placements. I'm in the advertising space, so obviously going to put that plug in there, but really allowing the opportunity for the user, or in this case, the buyer, on the supplier side, for sponsored placements, for example, ad placements, right? So if they want to get an extra boost, they want to get a little bit more visibility, you could potentially have them pay for paid advertising on your site. And then also ensuring, like, hey, there's top-notch keyword coverage, which is relevant to, your, basically, for example, if Denise is searching for a 4-star hotel, or she's searching for specific nights, that you're showing that content specifically, right? And then that will likely lead to high conversion rate as well. And then lastly here, so just kind of to sum things up and some tips and tricks. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really critical to understand customer problems to create a buyer persona. Again, that's the first step. And Again, buyer personas, it's less about profiling. It's less about just providing demographics, and really more about understanding behavior. And you also want to make sure, and also want to make sure that all of those behaviors are actionable, right? So again, it's not helpful to just have like an age or just like a location of where they live, but just making sure you're really honing in on some of the things that they do and how that can impact, your product development or your product strategy or marketing efforts or whatever that might be. Again, another thing is data is really important, as I mentioned. I would say if you can, I would try to make sure you get both qualitative and quantitative data, because again, that really kind of paints I would say a more accurate picture of, what your customer base looks like, and helps you to really shape a strong buyer persona. And then if you don't have, the analytics tools, you can't easily get the data, or you don't have the resourcing, which I know I've been in that situation. You make sure that you leverage teams that work directly with your target buyer. For example, if that's sales or another organization at your company, that can also be really helpful. Set up some time with them, set up a regular meeting to get constant feedback. I think that's really, really helpful. Another one too, which is kind of like a weird one, if you really can't you don't have analytics tools, if you can't easily get the data, don't have resourcing, reach out to your friends or family who have used your product, and get that feedback from them. That can kind of give you like a smoke signal, some kind of indication of, what are the customer needs, what are the customer problems. That can also be helpful. I would say that's a really scrappy way, but I think if you can't get the data otherwise, I think that's a really good option too. You also want to stay refreshed on the data and really make sure you're kind of staying up to date with times. Like, for example, I think travelers 3 years ago, pre-pandemic, had different pain points and customer problems than they do now, right? So that's just something you want to make sure that you're staying abreast of travel trends or whatever industry you're in. And so I think then you can think about refreshing your buyer personas accordingly. For example, in the past, maybe people were more into travel in general was a bigger thing, but I think maybe now they want to make sure that things are cleanly. So that has to be something that has to be taken into consideration as well. And you want to refresh your buyer personas accordingly and pivot and change your strategy when that does happen. And I would encourage you to also, test and learn, right? So less is more. I would start, as I mentioned earlier, I think starting out with just a few personas that kind of encompass like a majority of your target customers or your business, I think is helpful. And you can try that out and see if it's successful. If it is, great, keep doing that. If it isn't, then I think, you can reevaluate and look at the data again and just figure out what's going on. Why is this? What am I not? What about my product or feature is not solving the customer problem? And then you can kind of pivot from there. And I would say test and learn is a big thing. Like if you can do kind of small you can even do like a mini persona, and kind of just to get some kind of signal of whether that is the right path to go to approach, and then pivot accordingly after that. So all in all, I would say, again, major things are really making sure you're crisp on getting that data. And I think that will help set you up for success when thinking about, conversions and growing your business. So with that, that is all I've got for you guys, and I will hand it over to Georgina.
Awesome. Thank you. We have a quick survey for you guys, if you don't mind. We're going to put that in. And then we have tons and tons of questions for you, Mari. We've got some really interesting conversations happening in the chat, and some really good kinds of questions. So there's one that I want to start with and talk to you about, and that is really kind of how you talk to sales about your customers, about your what kind of questions to ask them, right? And so there's kind of a nuanced conversation that is happening in the discussion with Vicky and Kevin and Alexa are all kind of chatting about this, but really, what kinds of questions do you ask sales to get the right information that you need? How do you do that? And then also, where is the line between which questions that you ask your customers directly versus what you ask sales for about the customer? So kind of a nuanced conversation and different ideas happening in the chat right now. So I would love to have you weigh in on that topic too.
Yeah, sure. So the first question, I'll start with that. So you essentially want to know, like, how do you know what to ask sales is what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think for me, I think obviously I think sales and sometimes, product have different objectives in mind. And I think you got to make sure, I think one thing that I always start out with before talking to sales is making sure I understand what their kind of objectives and what their kind of business goals are, right? Because they don't always necessarily align. And I think that can be helpful to figuring out like what best to ask them. For me, it's really like, for example, I'll give you one. For what I do now, I work directly with our paid placements or paid listings on our site. And I essentially run our internal tool that allows merchants to basically advertise on our site, right? So right now, a lot of times, our sales are working directly with those merchants or those suppliers who are using that tool. Recently, I learned, hey, they are, once they kind of go through all of the steps in creating a sponsored deal, there's just a few steps to do that. There was a specific step, closer to the payment page where maybe they were not converting, right? So for me, I specifically looked up who those merchants were. I pinpointed, hey, who owns that relationship? And I just said, hey, like, what's going on, right? So I think you need to understand like what your problems are, where your kind of downfalls are in terms of your product features. And that will help guide that discussion and you can figure out what you need to ask sales. So like, that was obviously a very informal conversation, but I got a lot of insight. Like, for example, like one of the things is like, hey, they're a bit hesitant. They're not sure about what the impact of this would be and how that would really benefit their deals. And they're just a little bit iffy on that. Or, hey, they have too many, they have lots of business right now. And they don't really need to sponsor. They can't really handle more customers through their door. So things like that. I mean, I think you really want to make sure you understand kind of, I think again, you want to make sure you're understanding kind of their goals, which I think can kind of help provide and shape the discussion. And then you also want to make sure, like, for example, like where are the pain points and the downfalls with your own product or feature and that can help, I think, guide it.
Awesome. I think that's a really great addition to the conversation, which is also continuing in the chat. You can take a look at afterwards. We'll make sure that you get to weigh in there if you want to more. More of a quick question, I think, or maybe you can decide if it's a quick question or if it's more nuanced. David is curious how often you talk directly to your customer base, right? How often are you touching base with them? Do you have that kind of as a standard, or is it more as needed, et cetera? What happens for you in that space?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say it's definitely a mix. So when I say a mix, like there's some formal conversations that happen. Like I like to have like a regular check-in, for example, with like maybe some of the top sales folks and just say like, hey, what are we seeing? What are some of the customers? What are some of our merchants, for example, telling you that what are their pain points, right? Other times, like if you have a good relationship with your sales, they they should be reaching out to you already, right? You should already have that relationship, and you shouldn't have to like actively seek that out, ideally, right? And then I think there is, more informal, I would say, like discussions, for example, like if I'm looking through the data, or I see, I'm doing like a weekly business review or quarterly business review, and I see something that kind of just stands out to me, I might just like set up some time on, my sales colleagues' calendar, or I might just quickly ping them on Slack. It just kind of depends on the relationship that you have. But I would say, I think it's good to have those regular syncs, whether that's maybe like a monthly just check-in. And then when you uncover, maybe product areas that need improvement or anything like that, I think then you obviously want to make sure you're reaching out, right? So you need to, I would say like there's a mix of both.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about what kinds of info you can get from sales, what kind of info you get from customers. We have another question about which platforms you recommend using for market and customer research studies. You mentioned some research that you found from Google. Are there others that you recommend?
Yeah. So, well, for the travel industry, what I would use was like Focusrite. We had, I think, I don't know, I think every company has this. But I think, we had a really robust design, basically research team that would essentially like, hey, I'm seeing this kind of behavior. I really want to dig more into what's going on and what's driving that. That's another option. Google Analytics is like, that's less research, that's more, I guess, data, but Google Analytics is a good one if you have that set up. But honestly, sometimes, or any kind of like Harvard Business Review or some kind of study like that. I mean, sometimes I just like Google, like I'll just type in Google if I'm trying to find some specific data, and then I'll vet kind of the resources the sources that it's on. I think that's helpful there, but yeah.
Awesome. That's super helpful. And good kind of practical tips. We've got a couple questions in here that I'm going to stack up for you that are a little bit more hands-on about how you really go about putting these together, right? So the first one is about frequency and how often should buyer personas be updated? And is there a standard best practice that you have internally or that you have found in the industry for frequency of updating?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, I think if you're one, I guess, situation where I can think of where that it does need, I would say, changing is if your business strategy or your overall company objectives change, right? If you're pivoting, and I think that is happening a lot lately, especially with what's going on in the world. So I would say, it really depends. Like, I don't think there's a set like rule or a set number. It kind of just depends on the nature of your business as well, right? So I would say, like, if you obviously, I think as a product manager, you want to make sure that what you're building is in line with kind of the overall company objectives. Or, for example, we do OKRs. I'm sure a lot of companies do that as well. You just want to make sure that it's in line with that, right? So if I would say quarterly, you don't necessarily need to change, but maybe just double check and make sure, it aligns with kind of the business objectives and goals. Just kind of as a gut check, I would say quarterly would be a good kind of way to start. And then obviously yearly, I think, yeah, just make sure you're staying kind of up to date with, what the company is focused on, right? So if they're pivoting or shifting, then I think then that's I would say a perfect time to look at that and reevaluate.
Yeah, good advice. And then another question about kind of the number of personas is, how do you limit how many personas you have, right? I'm sure it's really tempting for people to be like, these are our 15 buyer personas, right? Usually it's a little bit harder to narrow than it is to go broad. So how do you limit the number of personas that you focus on?
Yeah, I would think, once you gather all that data, right, you should be able to pull out like major themes and trends, like that are, I would say that would represent like maybe a few personas, right? Like, I'd be really surprised if you had more than 10 or even 10 different personas. Like, you should be able to pull out those common themes in the data. So I would say, yeah, I mean, that is, I think, one thing to know, like when you have the data you need. And if ideally, I mean, it's like kind of like, you know, the 80-20 rule, like there's essentially you'd have like 80% of your, you know, or what is the rule now? I'm like blanking, but it's essentially like there should be a small subset of your customers that make up majority of the business, right? I mean, ideally, otherwise sometimes you can lose focus and you might not be able to do all of the personas or serve their needs really, really well, unless you're like a ginormous organization and you have all the resourcing, and that's not really likely. But at least I think from what I've seen, you know, sometimes it's really nice to, I think there's usually like only select few that really drive your business and really are those are the ones that, you know, result in conversions and business growth. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, really helpful. A question here that was really interesting to me, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on, that came from Alexa, asking if you typically use fictional names and photos when you are putting together your personas. And she mentioned that it can be difficult not to make generalizations when you're using kind of fictional names and photos, and curious if you've seen alternatives to that format or just how you approach it in general.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's an interesting question. I would say, yeah, I do use fictional names. I would say that's less important. I mean, it really more important is really like, what are the behavior patterns and like, what are they actually doing? Right. I think that's what you want to make sure you get right. Less so maybe the names or kind of what they look like. But yes, you have to be careful about those stereotypes. And that's why I think really making sure that once you have that qualitative data and that feedback or whatnot, you're also kind of matching it up and like comparing it to what you're seeing quantitatively, right? So I think it's hard sometimes with hard data to really get a clear picture of like who that person is, but I think having both, I think, can kind of give you a gut check. But yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's hard to avoid the stereotypes, but I think, you know, you kind of have to make sure that you have, like, I think the quantitative piece, I think, can help with that. And just having like if you can get enough, like, for example, if you're doing a qualitative study, try to get like enough people, right? So if it's like two people, that's probably not representative of your buyers, right? So if you can, I know it's not always possible, try to get a good sample size. I think that can help as well.
Yeah. Last question for you, a little bit more kind of tactically. In your opinion, who owns personas? Is it more something that sits with product management or product marketing?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the organization and your business. And I think sometimes, you know, product managers and product marketing, sometimes their work overlaps, or in some companies, product manager might do something that, I think it really depends. But ideally, what I would say is that you should be working together, right? If you have a product marketing team and a product manager, you guys should be aligned. So ideally, you guys would be, maybe, you know, for me, it's less about, I think ownership is helpful in terms of like trying to figure out maybe who drives it and who like eventually creates that and whatnot. But I would say like that collaboration is really key. I also know that, you know, for example, like design is another, like for my company, they're like the UX and design team they've done a lot of the buyer persona work on their side as well. So I think it just really kind of depends. But I think I think what's important is like you both align and like, hey, like if they are, you know, I don't know if it's design, you maybe, for example, if they're working on a buyer persona, like you come to them with like what you're seeing with the data, and then that can kind of help drive kind of how they're going about creating a buyer persona, right? And for a product manager, you know, like, you know, you obviously are you're kind of on the ground. They're trying to essentially market that product. And eventually, I think again, like they should really be working hand in hand together.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you also mentioned the kind of design team's hand in this work as well. Ayasha asked a question about working in an organization where product marketing is a little bit new, right? As kind of a group, and not being able to get what you need from the user-centered design team and asking for some advice. So if you have a design team and you're not, the relationship is not really as smooth as you might like it to be, and you're trying to follow your advice of working together, do you have any advice for a situation like that and starting to kind of smooth that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tough. And I think product managers have a really, I would say, like a tough role because there are so many different relationships and stakeholders that you have to have relationships with and have to get buy-in on. I would say one of the things with design, and from my experience, is they want to make sure you're thinking about the customer. And that sounds very cliche, right? Because we've been talking about this versus like just like, hey, I need to grow revenue by X%, or hey, I need to increase conversion by this percent. If you can show that you're really interested in understanding that customer, and maybe it's like setting up a meeting with them and saying like, hey, what's on your roadmap? Can you share what you know? Because I really want to make sure I understand the customer so that I'm like building the right product or feature, right? So I think it's kind of making sure, let them, I guess, like turn it around on them and say like, hey, I want to like understand where you're coming from. I want to help you maybe achieve your goals, right? And we can work together, because ultimately you're like, kind of corny, but you're one team, right? So you want to, I think you want to try and get them on your side. I think as if, all your stakeholders, ideally you want to make sure they, you guys are on the same team, you guys have that alignment. So I know that can be really tough and it's not always possible. I would say I'd had my fair share of challenges with, different stakeholders, but I think that's where I would start.
Awesome. It's a really, really elegant approach, I think. I think that's really smart, good advice. I'm hoping you've got a little bit more for us. Now we're going to go really high level. Carlos is working with his management team and wants to implement buyer personas as an initiative, but is having a hard time convincing them. So do you have any advice at the highest level about why having buyer personas is an excellent benefit for the company as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome that he's trying to push that. I know that pushing certain initiatives within the company can be really tough. So that's great. I mean, again, like I would say it really helps, it helps kind of get the entire team and company kind of aligned on the same goals, right? I think the other thing too is I think sometimes people forget like personas should be founded on data, right? Not just kind of like things we think, right? So I think if he could potentially share like, hey, I think that by doing these, we could really, it was probably too difficult to like say like, you can't really commit to like a specific impact or in the terms of like, hey, it's going to grow our sales or conversions by X amount, but he could probably share like, Carlos could probably share like, hey, I think that this is going to really help us drive our product strategy. Like this is founded on data. Most of the time people can't argue with data, right? Like, especially if it's the hard data, right? So I would say like, mention like, hey, I think this is really, and potentially have like maybe a plan, or what he could even try and do, and maybe this is already something he started, is create a mini persona and then put it into practice, like kind of do like a little smoke test, and then measure the results of it. And if it does well, which hopefully it will, then you circulate that and say like, hey, I did this and it resulted in this kind of growth. And then I think you can get that buy-in.
Awesome. I think that is a really nice place for us to kind of jump off from. So I am going to close us out here. First, with just an incredible thank you for the generosity of your knowledge that you shared with us, Mari. This has been really, really helpful. And there's a bunch of folks in the chat that are just delighted with this info and really grateful for it. And I also want to say thank you to all of our kind of community members that have been chatting and supporting each other in the chat. There's been some really great conversations going on there and exchanging ideas and insights. So I can encourage you to continue doing that with us. You can come hang out in the Pragmatic Alumni community and chat in there. And a lot of the resources that were discussed in the chat we have available in there for you as well to download if you like. But thank you so much, Mari. It has been an absolute delight to have you here. Really appreciate your time. This has been great.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure and a lot of fun. And I hope everyone on the call learned a little something. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks who are wondering, you can expect to see an email from us in the next couple of days in your inbox. We'll have a recording to this conversation for you. And until next time, we will talk to you soon.